Hello, everyone, and welcome to This Week in Global Development. I'm Anna Gavell, Managing Editor of Devex, filling in for Raj Kumar this week. Pleased to be joined by my colleague, Alyssa Miolene, who is based in Washington, D.C. Hi, Alyssa.
Hey Anna, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, doing well. And across the pond in London, we have Rob Merrick. Hi, Rob.
Hello, great to be here.
All right. So let's go ahead and dive in. We have a lot of big headlines, obviously, this week, and one of the bigger ones was the 1 year anniversary of the October 7th Hamas attack against Israel. And just wanted to mention that we had a fascinating story by our colleague Colum Lynch on the anniversary that illustrates just how politically sensitive it was in light of the ongoing war in Gaza. It was all about how UN agencies such as UNICEF were told not to frame fundraising appeals for Gaza around the 1 year marker to respect Israel's day of mourning. Some said that made perfect sense. Others found it hypocritical, given that similar fundraising appeals were made with key markers in, for example, the Ukraine war. So, anyway, check out the piece and make up your own mind. But I bring up Gaza not just because it's in the headlines this week. It's really been the headline humanitarian story of the year, alongside, to a degree, Ukraine as well. But many in our development space have actually pinpointed Sudan as the worst humanitarian crisis in the world at the moment. The 18-month war between the Sudanese army and rapid support forces has killed at least 20,000 people, although that is a gross underestimate by many experts, and displaced more than 10 million people. The health system is crumbling, cholera is spreading, and the specter of famine looms large. Despite how horrible the situation is, many people may not know much about it because of kind of the lack of coverage in mainstream media and attention among international policymakers. So, but now, Alyssa, you talked with Nicholas Kristof, the award-winning New York Times columnist, who has really chronicled the suffering in Sudan for many years, going back to Darfur. Can you just tell us a bit more about the conversation that you had?
Yeah, certainly. So Nicholas just got back from the border of Chad and Sudan. So like many folks, he was not able to actually enter the country, but he was on that, that borderline near Darfur. And he really saw kind of a number of the different things that are going on in the conflict through the eyes of folks who had fled. So a lot of stories of mass rape, mass executions, hunger crises, all sorts of just kind of the worst things that you could possibly ever think about. So he told me a little bit about what he did see during the UN General Assembly a couple of weeks back. Um, things are really, really desperate. I think that was the main takeaway. And I think there was, a bit of frustration and anger, at least on the part of Kristof and many others in the space of just, as you said, Anna, the lack of attention towards Sudan from the highest levels. I think, as you said, Gaza, for many reasons, has taken up so much air with humanitarian crises. And the reality is that there's a lot going on, and Sudan is one of them. I think, you mentioned the 20,000 figure, but there are, the US envoy for Sudan recently threw out 150,000 as a potential number. It could be as high as that. We just don't know. And, I remember going to the Hill, I guess it was back in March earlier this year, and the envoy was like, we have no numbers. We have no idea. One, because we're blocked. Two, because the scale is so extensive. And three, because it's just really hard to tell that humanitarian aid is not getting in. And that's a whole other issue here. So yeah, it was a really interesting conversation. I think it just begs, kind of the question of why it's been, the scale of this crisis, why it has been so kind of undercovered. I think that's changing a bit. I think we did see a bit of momentum at UNGA this year. There was a ministerial talk on Sudan. There were many side events on Sudan, so more than last year. But still, given the scale of the crisis, I think for many experts, it's like it's hit this breaking point where to not bring it up is just wild, crazy. So maybe I'll stop there for now.
Yeah, definitely a lot of frustration all around. Rob, did you have any thoughts on the piece and kind of the general neglect that plagues the Sudan crisis?
Yeah, so we hear the same message over here that pops up from time to time again, of course, that this is such a terrible tragedy and the world has turned its back. I suppose two things occur to me. One is that I hear regularly that the United Kingdom is the pen holder for Sudan at the United Nations. Now, I'll be honest, I'm not quite sure what that means in this context, because in terms of activity from the British government, it seems to mean, well, very little, possibly nothing. And the second thing that strikes me is I heard the outgoing UN humanitarian affairs chief, Martin Griffiths, speak when he was first at the UN. The idea of impartial mediation was, as he put it, on the up. And now he sees it as dead. He just sees the whole idea that there is an impartial mediator, that or somebody's willing to go in and try to keep warring parties apart and bring peace. That now that act is carried out by interested parties, as he put it. And as he put it, that's not mediation as I know it.
Yeah, definitely. From my perspective, what I find interesting is how geopolitics colors the humanitarian framing, if you will. Kristof, for example, mentioned the United Arab Emirates, which the New York Times and many others have accused of backing the rapid support forces and trying to kind of play kingmaker in the country's civil war. But the Emiratis are close to U.S. allies, and so the U.S. officials haven't publicly called them out. That includes, of course, President Joe Biden. They're not the only players fighting for power in Sudan. You've got the Russians, you've got the Egyptians, even the Houthis backing various factions. And meanwhile, these two various factions don't want to come to the negotiating table, so the U.S. is kind of stuck diplomatically. It has committed nearly $500 million in new aid, which of course is commendable. But just like in Gaza, the challenge is actually getting that aid inside the country. And again, I kind of circle back to geopolitics. As Kristof pointed out, the Middle East sucks up all the oxygen in the room. You've got the emotionally charged Israeli-Palestinian conflict that has been around for decades. But in general, of course, the Middle East, global oil prices are very heavily reliant on the region. So it's no coincidence that it's critical to the world. And likewise with Ukraine, the geopolitical dynamics of, a huge kind of Western adversary in the form of Russia invading a neighbor and kind of, triggering the first full-scale land war in Europe since World War II. Quickly attention and aid were diverted there. But even now we're seeing that attention to Ukraine waning given the crisis in Gaza. And I even wonder if Gaza will be shortly eclipsed by the Israeli military offensive in Lebanon. So I think it just kind of goes to show we hear a lot about donor fatigue, but I think there is this kind of crisis fatigue among the people, and that the world's bandwidth is very limited and fickle. There has been some quality coverage of Sudan, and like you said, Alyssa, it did get more play at the UN General Assembly. But I'm not sure what it will take for the war to kind of break into the mainstream psyche. And to be perfectly honest, I am going to end on a depressing note. I don't think it will in the near term, So on that very depressing note.
I do think something you said, Anna, is just really interesting, because it's even all of these multitude of crises that you've just mentioned. We did not mention Haiti, and we did not mention Myanmar, and we did not mention Afghanistan. This is the world that we're living in. It seems like there's constant red hotspots popping up all over the globe. Climate crisis is going to make that worse, exacerbate other issues. And I think it does give us a question that has always been in the ether, right? But for journalists and for those in the development and humanitarian spaces, what is our bandwidth, and how do we navigate all of these different crises and things going on to ensure that they each get the coverage and attention and response that they deserve, right? I think that's a really difficult question, and something that a lot of folks are grappling with right now. It was one that I did ask Nicholas Kristof, and I said, how do you prioritize? And he just said, I kind of push back on prioritizing anything. He kind of mentioned how whenever he puts out a story about X crisis or Y crisis, he gets emails saying, why didn't you cover this? You're covering this because you're disguising from this, or, kind of, there's all these mind games that you can get into with people thinking that you have an agenda about prioritization. But the point is, we have to just make room, and we have to expand our bandwidth, because we don't really have any other choice. So it's not an easy thing to do, but it's something that I think as the world continues to go toward, again, especially with natural disasters, et cetera, really think about prioritization and think about how we do make room for all the things that need global attention.
Yeah, and it's hard, in terms of bandwidth to think of spending. How much in resources? How much bandwidth do we have with spending and resources? And that is, limited. You're seeing spending cuts all over the world, Europe, potentially the U.S. here as well. And so I obviously kind of take a glass half empty approach, but as our colleague Vince Chadwick reported, Karsten Starr, who's the chair of the OECD Development Assistance Committee, takes, I think, like a glass half full approach. For those who don't know, the 32-member DAC is the main body that determines what qualifies as official development assistance. And that ODA is getting cut left and right. Check out actually last week's podcast where Vince and Dave and Fiona, our deputy managing editor, talked a lot about the aid cuts across Europe. But, beyond those cuts, there's this traffic jam of replenishments for major funds coming up this year. The reality at home for donors is pretty tricky. You've got inflation, budget deficits. But Carson Starr kind of has this very not rosy picture, but he insists that countries can do it all. They can fund domestic priorities, they can fund their militaries, all while mobilizing development assistance if the political will is there. And he cites COVID, for example, as an example. So, Rob, maybe we can start with you. What do you think of Starr's optimism in the face of some pretty pessimistic scenarios? I'll put it that way.
I think it's very, very surprising, is what I would say. And, I say that speaking, I like to think that I'm one of life's optimists, but perhaps not on the scale of Carsten. The big picture, as you say, is that aid budgets are being cut almost everywhere. And the other thing that strikes me is about a year ago, Carsten put out an appeal to countries to be cautious, as he put it, when it comes to diverting their aid budgets to the subsistence costs of asylum seekers in their own countries. And that message hasn't really been heeded, I don't think, by donor countries. I mean, I speak from the UK, where the government here does it most egregiously. Not all countries, in fact, no country does it as badly as Britain, but a lot of them do and have continued to do so. And of course, that exaggerates the true scale of aid that's getting through to where it's needed. I covered the ODA statistics for Devex early this year, and there was a small uptick in the amount that's reaching the poorest nations. So maybe that's some cause for Carsten's optimism, or maybe thinks his lottery numbers are going to come up next weekend.
I hope my lottery numbers come up. But anyway, Alyssa, what are some of your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I agree with Rob. I was surprised at this piece. I think I was also coming out of it. I'm working on a story about cuts to health funding across the sector as well. And I had my head in data yesterday. The One Campaign recently, an advocacy group based in DC, just came out with a number of different analyses on the way in which health funding has kind of gone down over the years, and nearly every country has done that. And I guess I had my head in that data and looking through, okay, all these downward trending charts globally, especially in Europe. And then I see this and I was kind of like, well, that's nice. I think let's see what happens. I'm not incredibly convinced, again, because potentially I am the opposite of Rob, and given what I've looked at yesterday, was not feeling particularly optimistic about the aid sector and financing. But at the same time, I do think that there are organizations that have done very well. I mean, another story I was just working on, a UN-hosted fund had just hit its replenishment targets, the highest ever. So there are these bright spots, and I do think that perhaps maybe looking at some of these bright spots and some of the ways that things are working can kind of help us battle that fatigue that we were just talking about with Sudan and others. So yeah, I say let's see what happens. Let's see how the rest of the year goes with a number of different replenishments. I think there's 11 major replenishments over the last several years until 2025. So there's a lot of competition, and I think we'll kind of see how that all pans out.
Yeah, that's a huge number. And like we said, given limited resources, I think the other thing that was interesting, Starr it wouldn't surprise me if he's being very diplomatic, but he disputed this notion that lower income countries are getting shortchanged by what many say is Europe's kind of self-interested version of aid spending. Starr said that global solidarity and support for those who have less are ingrained ideas in European development policy. But Rob, you had an article about a recent analysis that big companies in the EU have been beneficiaries of the bloc's flagship development program, which is known as the Global Gateway, and that this has come at the expense of poverty reduction in lower income countries. Can you tell us a bit more about that study that you wrote about?
Yes, this is the other key issue, isn't it? That's how much of aid and development money that actually leaves the shores of donor nations, what is it actually being used for? Now, it's been a persistent criticism that Devex has covered. EU's Global Gateway project is really about EU strategic national geopolitical interests rather than the interests of the people in low-income countries where investments are being made. And this is a more detailed exploration of that criticism where several civil society networks in Europe have looked at a spectrum of projects and are pointing out in just how many of them the beneficiaries are very large European companies, some of which sit on the advisory board for Global Gateway. And questioning, well, in fact, calling for a proper audit by the European Court of Auditors into whether that sort of setup complies with the EU's founding treaties, that aid should be used for the reduction of poverty. I suppose my feeling about the story is that the two sides are really just talking past each other, in that the civil society groups quite rightly feel they can point out that they need to point out that it doesn't appear that aid is being used for its original purpose. But in a sense, the EU is not even pretending that it is. It doesn't really even pretend that Global Gateway is about poverty reduction. It bills it as an instrument to challenge China's Belt and Road Initiative and China's perceived grip on investment opportunities around the world. And through what the EU calls a partnership, it believes that both sides will benefit. But it's saying this is for our greater good as well as yours. So in a sense, it feels like if somebody came to watch me play soccer, as I should learn to call it, instead of criticizing my soccer skills, they would say, well, why aren't you playing cricket? It's almost entering a completely different argument. And as I say, I feel like the two sides are really talking past each other.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you mention China because, like you said, Global Gateway is kind of seen as the rebuttal to China's Belt and Road Initiative. It's focused on sectors like energy, on infrastructure, et cetera. Not so much health and education, and again, sometimes I know I sound like a broken record about this, but geopolitics is always so closely intertwined with development aid. And, or whether it's the increased push for aid or preventing cuts from aid, you're now seeing this kind of possible return to the days of tide aid, are making a reappearance. Building up trade and investment opportunities is key. Political strategic interests are key. And of course, tackling China is key. And we see that here in the US. It's a really handy argument that a lot of development advocates make to US policymakers, that we don't want to cede any ground to China. And it's almost gotten to the point where this argument is a bit jaded. US lawmakers have heard it quite a bit. But again, I just think it goes to show, this has kind of been, Rob, like you said, it's obvious now. Geopolitical self-interest is a running theme among donor countries, and it's kind of an unabashed stance, at least when it comes to the EU. Alyssa, I don't know if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of come from it covering, the US government here in DC. I come at the story from the US lens, right? And I think, as you mentioned, Anna and Rob, this is what development is to a certain extent. It is soft power, at least it's very much coined that way in the US. And, there are many incredible programs, but ultimately when the US government is committing taxpayer dollars, and I'm sure similar to in many European governments, there's a cyclical return that's expected to come back. Another kind of country that's also looking, I mean, every country does this, but to a certain extent, I had a conversation with the head of JICA, the Japanese aid agency, a couple of weeks back. And, similar types of arguments there. They're very big on concessional loans, low interest loans and grants to some extent, but mostly these kind of easy, accessible loans to various countries. And many of those countries are places where the Japanese can ultimately do business in, right? Bolstering that economy, making those, investments, and whether they be kind of initiatives in Malawi or initiatives in, one of them, for example, that JICA has done was to finance via loans the New Delhi Metro. So these types of things where there is a push and pull of what is the point of development, right? And I think sometimes we can lose that when we're just looking at like the good that a development program is doing. But when they do come from government organizations, government aid, taxpayer dollars, it's important to remember that is the argument. That is the argument that many are working with. And that is often how, at least in the US, the money is issued from Congress, right? There's a moral imperative, and then there's the what can this do for us? And how will this repay us eventually down the line?
Yeah. And speaking of the US, we obviously have a somewhat big election coming up. And that could, depending on who wins, we could be looking at a vastly different development budget, international affairs spending. Over in the UK, though, there was a definitive election. You had Labour won power. Development advocates thought it would help their cause after years of cuts, but kind of lo and behold, Labour seems to have put the kibosh on a lot of these hopes. Rob, you wrote about how Prime Minister Keir Starmer, apparently rejected advice that he could restore a separate aid department, according to a new book. So tell us a bit about that. And is the famous DFID, the former development department, is DFID dead? I guess I should say. I'll be dramatic about it.
DFID is dead, and at the moment staying dead. That's definitely the case. I think we're at a really interesting moment in British political debate about aid and development now, because, as you say, under the last government, what happened was widely perceived to be a disaster. Massive cuts, a botched merger of foreign affairs and development, which led to a dramatic loss of expertise as well as a loss of programs. The aid sector believed that things would change when Labour was elected and came to power. That was 3 months ago. Nothing has changed. And in fact, the Labour government has signalled that it really pretty much intends to carry on as before, even though it described the previous effort as degraded and criticised it so much. Now, I think the sector, aid sector, and also think tanks, academics, former development officials have been prepared to sit on their hands for a while, but I suspect that a tipping point is not far off. And unless they hear something new, different, encouraging, positive soon, then the dam will burst, and that will possibly come to a head when we have a budget here in the UK at the end of the month. And then separately, a book has been published by a former head of the Department for International Development and also another former UN humanitarian affairs leader, Mark Lowcock, and his assistant, who are revealing that Keir Starmer sought advice from a range of experts about what he should do if he came to power. Should he bring back a separate aid department? He was told yes, and that could be done with minimum disruption and cost, and it didn't happen. And Keir Starmer has never explained why not. He's never explained why he's not doing anything significantly different from the past. And I think there is now pressure on him as Prime Minister to come out and explain what, if anything, he's actually trying to achieve in the development world.
And you have a bit of an exclusive that literally just came out in terms of that also kind of reinforces this confusion or lack of clear direction among Labour when it comes to development. Do you want to? We're running low on time, but do you want to briefly kind of mention that as well?
Yeah, so very quickly, a woman called Minouche Shafik, who of course is known on both sides of the Atlantic, over there for having been president of Columbia University, over here for being a former development leader, is carrying out a review for the government, which is supposedly just into how to sort of restore capacity capability rather than into policy. But she gave, a fairly indiscreet briefing to former DFID staff that somebody kindly passed to me, in which she pretty much says what we've just been saying, that the Labour government hasn't explained what on earth it's trying to achieve in aid and development beyond these sort of buzzwords of let's make it modern, let's have equal partnership. What does that actually mean? Nobody has said. And so I think what Shafiq is saying is that she's taking it upon herself to plug that gap when she carries out her review, even though that's not really the remit of her review. So that's going to be very, very interesting in the next few months.
Does this make you feel better a bit, Alyssa, that UK's politics is just as messy as our politics?
I have to be honest, it does. Thanks, Rob, for your reporting.
Yeah, well, we are low on time, but kind of circling back to the U.S. and D.C. specifically, we've got the World Bank spring and fall annual meetings coming up in just, I think, 2 weeks. So we will be talking about that in future podcasts. We also have our big event called Devex World that's taking place in DC as well. For those who are in our nation's capital, go to devex.com. There are still some tickets available if you want to attend in person. It is an in-person only event. And we will be there. Alyssa and I will be there along with quite a few Devexers. And in the meantime, if you're not already subscribed, please subscribe to our Newswire daily newsletter so that you get caught up on all of these stories and more. And I want to thank my colleagues, Alyssa, Rob. Thanks so much for the conversation today.
That's been great fun. Great to be here.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks, Rob.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Bye.